This video will get to know the so-called exposing a test strip technique, used by almost all past photographers. In this method, we expose the paper coated with the sensitizer gradually, until we reach the darkest color that can be achieved with the selected photographic process. The time at which the darkest shades are achieved, is the so-called optimum exposure time, or standard printing time, or basic printing time. After searching for the standard print time, we also need to find the exposure time that corresponds to the negative. This is when white areas of paper are still visible on the paper covered with the darkest color of the negative. Let's start. We plot the time intervals of exposure on paper measuring 10 by 20 centimeters or 8 by 4 inches. The length of the intervals, of course, depends on the photographic technique. We most often illuminate at slightly longer, almost excessively long intervals. In our case, we opted for 1-minute intervals. We coat the sensitizer on paper and prepare it for exposure. Over half of the paper, we fix a transparent film that we use to make the negatives. We place the paper and negative in the exposure unit or in the sun. Then we place the opaque material on the first area of the paper. This must completely block the penetration of UV light. The first zone will thus be completely unlit. After the first minute has elapsed, we push the opaque paper to the next line and continue exposing the paper. After the second minute, we push the paper to the next line. And so on until the zone is exposed and covered. Once the paper is developed and dried, the results are reviewed. If we notice on half of the paper covered with the negative, some noticeable transitions, and some almost identical, dark tones, we have chosen the correct interval for the exposure. We also notice the same color shade on the first half of the paper covered with the negative and the second uncovered half. Suppose we notice only a few zones on paper with visible transitions, and all the other zones are completely dark. In that case, it means that the exposure interval was too long. We must reduce the exposure interval by half, say from 1 minute to 30 seconds. Then we repeat the test. In case we do not notice almost the same shades of dark color on the paper, we increase the exposure intervals. Most often, twice or 4 times the value. Once we have properly exposed the test scale, we review the exposure results. Standard exposure time is where 2 dark colors on the same, covered half of the paper are almost identical. If we can't decide on the printing time, we opt for a time where the 2 color shades on the paper's uncovered and covered halves are the same. In our case, the exposure time is 6 minutes. The next step is to review the white tones. If the unexposed area of the negative is too dark for our sense, we can lighten it with selected techniques if desired. These techniques depend on the photographic process chosen, so we cannot present them here. Standard print time is basically just the exposure time at which the sensitizer achieves the best results. We must therefore adopt this time to our negatives. If we expose a negative with this standard time, this may be too long, or it may be too short. If it is too long, we lose all bright tones in the image. The negative cannot block all UV light. The whiteness test is performed as follows. We draw some lines on paper of the same size as in the first test. In the middle is the standard exposure time. Below and above the standard time, we write some shorter periods. For example, suppose our exposure time is 20 minutes. In that case, we plot the shortened times by about a minute and increase the upper times. We then print on a transparent film a rectangle of the darkest color to be used in printing. We place the negative on paper and start to expose it for the shortest time. When this ends, we begin to cover other time zones. Until we exposed all areas. The paper is developed, dried, and the results reviewed. If the white color below the negative at all intervals is white, we can increase the exposure time. If we notice areas colored under the negative, our right exposure time will be where the whites are not colored. If all the whites under the negative are stained, we need to shorten the exposure time. Most often, we shorten it by half. We then perform the described whiteness test again. I hope you learned something new. Have a nice time until next week, when we will learn another technique for finding exposure time, this time using a step tablet.